3,000 years ago, in North America's Eastern Woodlands, a great society arose. They brought a wave of agriculture, engineering, and monumental architecture. These were the Hopewell and the Adena, the Mound builders. And they left behind marks on the landscape felt across Canada and the USA that are still sacred to local native groups, wowed the incoming settlers, and set about the birth of American archaeology. Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the archaeologist, now let's get into the travels. The story of the mound builders begins at the Ohio River with the rise of the Adena around 1000 BCE. Some sources place the start of the Adena a few centuries earlier or later, and this is because these people left behind no written records, so our only method to date involves a handful of radiocarbon dates, dendrochronology, stratigraphy, and a mix of other techniques that don't really get a real consensus. Get used to this being a recurring theme in archaeology taking place without historical records. The Adena were the first of the Eastern Woodlands mound builders, and where they came from is somewhat debated. They seemed to have a strong desire to bind the skulls of some individuals and elongate their heads, which led some scholars to posit that they came from the Olmec culture, where this was also a common practice. However, if this is the case, and the Adena were Olmec refugees after the fall of the empire, then no other evidence allows for this. They share no other similarities. The real answer is that it was a progression of local groups, and while they probably did have some outside influence, which I'll speak of later, the Adena were homegrown locals to the Ohio River Valley, and these mounds were an entirely local achievement. And the Adena represented not just a new phase in culture, but brought about a paradigm shift for the wider region. Prior to the Adena, the people of the Eastern Woodlands were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. A few of them used copper, but they lived hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, people settled down and built a massive civilization that spanned half a continent. The Adena were the first people of the region to use pottery, making thick-walled vessels and grinding tables. Copper and slate gorgets were also very popular. They introduced agriculture, growing pumpkins and other various gourds, sunflowers, and goosefoot, with maize being introduced by the 3rd century BCE. Most profitably, they grew tobacco, which not only found a large trade network, but also made Adena smoking pipes elaborate works of art, which also became highly coveted as a result. They were astronomers, engineers, traders, and metalworkers in a region that had little experience in such fields prior to this. But most noticeably, they built huge mounds, sometimes in elaborate designs, some over 20 meters high. These were mostly tombs, however, there are ridges and circles taken as sacred sites as well. And these tombs reveal a sort of hierarchy, although in what capacity is hotly debated. Some have suggested that they were chiefly families and a generational hierarchy, while others suggest that power was handed to individuals semi-democratically, somewhat of a heterarchy. These elite individuals seem to have no relation based on gender either. Several tombs of powerful females in the Adena mounds have been discovered, with one woman's grave in the McKees Rock Mound in Pennsylvania containing more than 500 grave goods, which is very rich in comparison. It's also noted that the Adena had an affinity for very tall people in their elaborate tombs in positions of leadership. To be honest, while I find the heights of these skeletons unusual for the people of the time, I don't really want to spend too much time on it. It's amazing how many papers on the Adena seemed obsessed with skeletal shape and size, whether they're robust or gracile, trying to determine race and ethnicity. It reeks of early thoughts on the topic, which I'll get into later. At any rate, these goods tell us that these mound graves were the preserve of the elites. They also speak to earlier local cultures. Remember the copper culture? Well, if you don't, I have a video on it, and remember to like and subscribe. I do a lot of various topics and videos that will cover the globe eventually. And I'll actually research it too. I'm not going to use AI to pretend I did. Anyway, as copper became a luxury good, we began to see it used in more elaborate and luxurious ways. For example, copper beads in one Adena tomb suggest they had been sewn into a piece of clothing that did not survive. So the Adena were practicing embroidery, which is interesting but may not actually be helpful. See, not a lot is clear about how to really define the Adena. Was this one culture expanding across many areas, or was this the start of a trend that other people emulated? Looking at art and expression, it doesn't help much. There is a recurring theme of a bear cult seemingly centered around, of course, bears, but this artistic expression takes many forms. Because the Adena began a huge artistic tradition that continued into the historic period, it's hard to say why anyone was doing anything. The Adena certainly engaged in warfare too, living in small villages fortified with ditches and in defensive areas, with some graves containing war wounds suggesting that they were on the expansion. And if it was an empire, then we can expect that it was heterogeneous, made up of various people and allied or conquered tribes, as is the case with the vast majority of empires. But whether this expansion was through political, economic, or military force, the Adena expanded along the whole Ohio River Valley into the Chesapeake Bay area and to the edge of the Great Plains. But even this sphere of influence was dwarfed by the Hopewell. The Hopewell arrive on the scene around 100 BCE, but by arrive I mean that the Adena evolved. The difference between the Adena and the Hopewell is really just a question of academics. The fact is, these were the same people. They're about as different as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The main difference is that everything the Adena did, the Hopewell did better. Their pottery becomes very fine with elaborate art. It also starts to include other vessels like bowls and jars for more sedentary living. Copper, likewise, remained in use, getting more elaborate, and they even began to work with meteoric iron, beginning a sort of pre-Iron Age North America. Hopewell architecture became more monumental, and their trade much richer and wider. Their houses shifted from round, all-purpose affairs to square rooms, allowing for specialization and privacy, and more efficient for long-term sedentary living. The Ohio and Indiana Hopewell in the Adena heartland were the most elaborate expression of the Hopewell culture, and they had a very wide-ranging trade network. The Hopewell of this region had obsidian coming from Yellowstone, copper from Lake Superior, silver from Ontario, mica from the Appalachians, and shells from Florida. And while the Adena were limited to the Ohio River Valley and parts of the Great Lakes, the Hopewell seemed to expand everywhere. But again, exactly how much the Hopewell politically controlled, assuming of course that they were ever a central authority, which is also not known, is debated. There are over 170 mounds in Ohio alone, by far the largest concentration, but that doesn't mean they only exist there, or that the Hopewell were the only ones building them. Burial mounds in Canada, for example, stretch from southern Quebec to the shores of Lake Winnipeg, but this is typically considered Western Shield or Laurel culture, a separate identity from the Hopewell. Among their ruins include the Long Saul site along the Rainy River in Ontario, which is the largest man-made structure in Canada from before the colonial period. It's not certain if this was an expression of Hopewell tradition, but it was undeniably inspired by it, and it was connected to the trade routes. The Linear Mound site in Manitoba, again way up here, contained shells from the Gulf of Mexico. Expressions of Hopewell culture can be found all along the Mississippi. There were clear lines of communication between the people of the prairies and the Hopewell on the borders of the regions and with the Atlantic. Prairie nomads could easily act as go-betweens or even guides to the Mesoamerican sphere on the other side of their lands. It's very easy to see a possible connection with the societies of Mexico even if there is not yet much material evidence. An exchange of knowledge and goods is very difficult to deny, especially knowing the extent of political influence both of these regions had. The arrival of maize and a fascination with astronomy echo earlier Mesoamerican trends, and furthermore a lack of evidence of trade routes isn't really a denial of their existence, especially in the case of the Hopewell. Take the obsidian from the Rockies, for example. It doesn't seem to be traded. If it was traded, we'd expect a string of outposts and obsidian remains from Wyoming, but we don't really see that. This suggests one of two possibilities, that the Ohio Hopewell were actually launching expeditions to collect obsidian themselves, or that people from all over the continent brought it to the Hopewell directly, perhaps as an offering as part of a pilgrimage. This second theory seems to be more favored, especially as Hopewell mounds remained points of pilgrimage into historic times, as colonists witnessed them making treks into these places. And if they could spread so far, what was to stop the lines of communication between Mesoamerica and the Ohio Valley, even if through middlemen? As to Hopewell architecture, that is truly spectacular. These earthwork mounds are almost certainly for ceremony, not settlement, and the architecture reflects that. Their complexes are larger and more elaborate, such as the Newark Sacred Center near Columbus, Ohio. A lot of this complex was sadly destroyed, however, and the massive central octagon only survives in a golf course. Yeah, I'm just going to move past that. The Newark Mounds would have included thousands of people for ceremonies, and it was by far the largest complex ever built by the Hopewell people. This site would have been a center of sacredness and could have told us a lot about the culture, again if it wasn't destroyed by a country club. Nope, I said I wasn't going to fall for that. I'm going to move on. The Hopewell loved geometric shapes, and many of them seem to line up with the lunar calendar. Their most impressive works exist in Ohio and Indiana. Their largest burial complex is Mound City in Chillicothe, Ohio. The significance of these burials are apparent as they are numerous and many of them are very wealthy, but the significance is also seen in the name. Chillicothe means principal city in the native language. The Hopewell burials tended to be conical or leaf-shaped, unlike the geometric mounds used predominantly for ritual. They contain both inhumations and cremations, and they suggest a powerful hierarchical structure. Again, across the Hopewell, we find that animal cults and shamanism are very common, with ritual tobacco pipes getting more elaborate and valuable than their Adena predecessors. But the Hopewell didn't live in these sacred spaces. As I said earlier, the Hopewell lived in villages with square rooms, better for the specialization and more the mark of a sedentary lifestyle. This was a likely change from the Adena and certainly a change from earlier cultures, which were nomadic or semi-sedentary. The Hopewell, however, seemed to live fully sedentary lifestyles with multi-generational dwellings and the burials of pet dogs. Some scholars still argue for the existence of a semi-sedentary lifestyle, but this is harder to argue given we collect more and more evidence. It was obvious that the Hopewell had some level of political cohesion as well, because many of these disparate villages could be mobilized to do work, but again it is uncertain at what level. The Hopewell might also seem to engage in warfare. In addition to weapons and armor being found among some burials, they also built hill forts, among them the Fort Ancient Earthworks in Ohio, the largest hilltop enclosure in North America. A large hill surrounded by an embankment, it seems clear that this was built for defense. Yet, unlike the Adena, the Hopewell didn't really show any evidence of warfare. Many of their villages are no longer built in defensive positions, they do not contain any defensive fortifications, and very few burials appear to have died in warfare. Although war trophies are still common in burials, they may be more ancestral or ritualistic. So what's going on? Did the Adena conquer an empire and allow their later Hopewell descendants to exist in a state of peace, a bit like the Roman Empire, which was relatively peaceful within its own borders? Or was it actually a society that promoted peace through negotiation, cooperation, and alliances? There are numerous possible explanations for this odd lack of warfare among the Hopewell, but none are proven. But whoever the Hopewell were, they did begin to decline. They disappeared sometime between 400 and 600 CE. Much like how they lived, how they declined is a mystery. Some have suggested that the bow and arrow's introduction to the region around the 5th century led to a decrease in wild game resources and an increase in warfare. Another theory states that tobacco, which had been so important to the Hopewell economy, was no longer coveted, partially because maize had surpassed tobacco in value, and partially because new centers of tobacco production had cropped up, breaking the Hopewell monopoly. Political fragmentation may have also occurred. It's likely to come down to a variety of factors, but one thing is agreed on: Hopewell civilization did end, and it ended pretty harshly. People once more retreated into fortified settlements. Art, ritual, and pottery declined, monumental architecture was abandoned, and trade networks shrank. For this reason, it is sometimes termed a cultural collapse, but it's not quite so simple. For one thing, the population seems to have actually increased with larger villages, albeit fortified ones. Villages may have simply opted to look inward and fractured away from each other. Likewise, the cultures that followed suggest that perhaps following the fragmentation of the Hopewell, the native groups merely formed new states, if you want to use that term. The Mississippian cultures of Cahokia, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Algonquin, and the precursors to the Powhatan Confederacy, and others on the Hopewell periphery all formed their own governments, villages, and new spheres of influence. The trade network declining also isn't really true. Hopewell-style pipes found near Montreal date to 400 years after the Hopewell faded, a testament to the memory left behind that still persisted. Centers of power fragmented and shifted, either causing or caused by the Hopewell decline. And when settlers arrived, seeing these abandoned mounds, they too were wowed by them. And this brings me to the history of the archaeology, which is equally as fascinating. I said these mounds were the birth of American archaeology, and what's more American than a founding father? The first scientific archaeological excavations in the United States were on the Hopewell Mounds, done by Thomas Jefferson on his own property. Back in the 1750s, Jefferson witnessed natives still visiting these mounds on his Virginia property near Monticello, today called the Jefferson Mound site. 3 guesses as to why. But these memories stuck with him, and after getting a little sidetracked, he returned to these mounds in the 1780s. At the time, the Hopewell Mounds were known, but not believed to be of native origin. Native Americans were thought to be too primitive, animalistic, and stupid to build such monumental architecture. Theories for the mounds at the time ranged from Phoenicians and Crusaders to Indo-Aryans coming in various ways and building them, only to be wiped out by these more primitive savages. The idea of a glorious white Aryan society building great works only to be wiped out by a vicious and savage less white native people held a lot of sway at this time, and it was often used as a justification to wipe them out in turn. They killed people before, so now you can kill them, except you killing them is more civilized because you were civilizing them by wiping them out, just as they did to more civilized people before you. Try not to think too hard, this is about white supremacy, not logic. But yeah, Jefferson didn't buy this either. As a student of the Enlightenment, he knew that the simplest explanation was probably the right one. So he was convinced that the natives built these mounds. And sure enough, as Jefferson dug into the mounds, he discovered grave goods and artwork that were undeniably Native American in nature. Jefferson's methods were far from perfect. He reburied the finds rather than documenting them, he did not conduct follow-up studies, and he failed to research native culture, drawing conclusions on artifacts from his own point of view rather than seeking to understand the local beliefs. Perhaps most egregiously, he also failed to take field notes, only noting his findings later in his Notes on the State of Virginia. But given that this was the 1780s, his methods were an honest academic attempt. Jefferson had a deep interest in native culture. He understood the West was not empty, as some narratives at the time had suggested, but full of conflicting nations, histories, and interests. He held a firm belief that the natives were just as civilized and conscious as the white man, a remarkably progressive view for his time. Yet, he still wanted to rule them and wipe out these cultures that so fascinated him. He advocated both for manifest destiny and native relocation programs. In short, history and people are complicated. And despite Jefferson conclusively proving a local origin, racist theories about the mounds persisted and, in some corners, continue to persist. With this study, Jefferson was nevertheless considered the father of American archaeology, and while it was clumsy, it was an early attempt done in good faith, which, honestly, I do respect. And the Hopewell were a great people to study. We can often forget that empires and massive cultural networks existed, especially in this region of the world, but the Hopewell proved this assumption wrong. They held total cultural dominance over the eastern half of North America for over 1,000 years, influencing every aspect of society and politics, so much so that their memory is still felt by local native groups 1,500 years later. These mounds stand as a testament to a major network that once existed, connecting all the people of the Eastern Woodlands to a wider world, binding them in a shared cultural value, and creating a region of peace and prosperity, even if it did eventually come to an unknown end. Anyway, that's all I have to say on the Adena and the Hopewell. Thanks for making it to the end of the video, and until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.